There are calculators online where people can go and put their council tax banding into these land tax calculators. And you can see in some areas where you might be able to afford the council tax of £3,000 to £4,000 a year. In some cases, that goes up to £8,000, £9,000, £10,000 a year. And the people who are living in those properties may not be able to afford that and ultimately would have to move. Now, the Times has revealed allies close to Andy Burnham believe they've succeeded in stopping Ed Miliband from becoming the country's next Chancellor. The Labour leader's first day in office is on Monday, where he's expected to announce his cabinet. We don't know much about what Andy Burnham's economic policies are, but he reportedly backs a land value tax to replace stamp duty. And the reason that's important is because some people say, actually, it doesn't matter that much who the Chancellor is going to be, because Andy Burnham himself is going to control the direction of travel much more than previous Prime Ministers have. Well, we're joined now by Gerard Lyons, Chief Economist at Net Wealth and Research Fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies. Also has some experience of working between politics and policy. Good morning.
Hi, good morning. Great to be on the show.
Great to have you with us. But before we look at the policies that we think Andy Burnham may be considering and what they might mean for our listeners, why do you think there's been so much attention on the idea of Ed Miliband as the Chancellor?
Well, this has been built up to be such a big issue, and it's largely because the new Prime Minister faces two strongly competing, opposing forces. One is the demands, particularly of his backbenchers, maybe of some of his voters, to spend more, despite the fact that the fiscal numbers are very fragile and poor. And against that, the financial markets that want a fiscally responsible approach. So basically, he's got two competing forces: spend more money, boost government spending, in the consequences, raise taxes, increase borrowing more, and the financial markets are saying, hold on. So given that his demands are going to be constrained by economic and fiscal reality, by the bond markets, and also by Treasury's orthodoxy, the role of Chancellor becomes even more important, shall we say, than usual.
Oh, that's interesting that you think that, because, you know, one of the things that people are saying about Andy Burnham is that he intends to do things differently when it comes to the Treasury this time round, and maybe reduce the amount of power the Treasury has, or control the Treasury has, over the direction of travel, take some of that back into Number 10. And of course, he's also got this idea about Number 10 North, so there's a bit of a devolution of power, if you like, already going on there. Do you think there's anything in that argument? Because that then means it's even more important that we understand what's driving Andy Burnham forward.
Yeah, well, I think it's important to understand why that argument's being made. I've made it myself in the past. Basically, in other countries, you have a number of different departments that do the role of the Treasury. Here in the UK, the Treasury is a super ministry. It has economic responsibility, fiscal responsibility. And as I say, in other countries, those roles tend to be divided. John Maynard Keynes back in the 30s, Wilson in the 60s when he was Prime Minister, and Wilson and Gordon Brown all wanted to take on the Treasury. The only one of those who actually made some headway was Wilson back in the 60s when he temporarily set up a Department of Economic Affairs. The argument has always been that the Treasury has focused maybe too much on the fiscal numbers. You have to say they haven't done a very good job if that is the case, and therefore you need to have a department that focuses more on the economy. Now, given it's been said before, given it is a valid issue, one might think that the new Prime Minister might try and achieve that. But when you look at Prime Ministers, say, since, let's go back to the 1970s, most of the Prime Ministers who've been there for any length of time try to have chancellors who very much align with their economic thinking. Heath, Thatcher, Major, Johnson, Truss, they've had more than one chancellor. The other Prime Ministers have always had one chancellor. But push comes to shove, I think that Burnham will want to have more devolution. That's probably not going to be successful as he hopes. But when it comes to macroeconomic policy, the concerns that the Treasury do raise are very valid concerns at the moment, given the high level of public spending, high level of tax, high level of debt and borrowing.
And so something like we often hear it referred to as a land tax, changing the way that tax works in this country around what people pay in council tax, maybe changing stamp duty, to combine all those things into one, which would fairly value the land that the property is built on as opposed to the property itself. Might something like that be workable and a good idea?
Okay. The real issue is public spending is too high, and that's the issue that needs to be addressed. When we come down to where the taxes are raised, Britain actually taxes land probably more than any other country in the world. Israel might be the exception. So we tax land already very heavily, but we tax it in a very stupid way. There was a review of taxation and fiscal powers about 15 years ago, the Merlees Commission, and he was a very restrained economist, and he used the word stupid to describe land tax because, stamp duty. Sorry, he used the word stupid to describe stamp duty because stamp duty basically deters people from moving. It deters turnover. So if we had a land value tax to replace stamp duty, in theory, that could work. The question is what level you set it at. In theory, again, and I'm saying theory because these things have to be put into practice. Land value taxes don't tax the dwelling, they tax the land. Therefore, if they are applied efficiently, then they would force better use of land, particularly in urban areas. The trouble is that many of the people who are calling for this tax don't seem to be calling for other taxes to be cut. So as long as we don't have an additional tax, but we have a sort of replacement aimed at economic efficiency, then it could work. But the point is really, many of these taxes, it depends what level you apply them at and how you apply them alongside other taxes.
But for example,
so execution of these policies is the key issue.
Well, and that's the point here, isn't it? Because, Gerard, there are calculators online where people can go and put their council tax banding into these land tax calculators. And you can see in some areas where you might be able to afford the council tax of £3,000 to £4,000 a year. In some cases, that goes up to £8,000, £9,000, £10,000 a year. And the people who are living in those properties may not be able to afford that and ultimately would have to move.
That's right. And I think it's important to stress that these issues are not being discussed for the first time. They've been discussed time and time again, even in my time in the city. And over the last 60, 70 years, they always come to the fore. And the point, despite the criticisms that's levied at the Treasury, they've always made the valid point before that you need to have taxation linked to people's ability to pay. Hence, their argument has always been that you need to actually have taxes on income because you can see people earning the income, or you need to have taxes on transactions. Once you start to have perceived taxes on wealth or on assets, then you often end up taxing people who don't have the ability to pay. The markets don't actually allow people really to borrow effectively against their underlying assets. And once you go down this route towards more wealth type taxes, what's always happened internationally is that you end up hitting the middle classes rather than the people you want to initially end up targeting. But you're right, once you actually start taxing based on assets, not necessarily on income, then you have a lot of people who are basically maybe potentially asset rich but cash poor, but even the asset value is itself going to be devalued by the fact that the taxes are now going to be placed on it. So it's a very complex situation. But coming back to the issue really is that debt levels are high, borrowing are high, the markets are worried because they think public spending needs to be reduced, and the markets are worried that if you start going down the route of just adding another layer of taxation, albeit in this area of land, but you add more and more taxes, then the economy's growth rate will suffer. And what you really need to do to make progress, as the new Prime Minister will find out, is to actually keep inflation down and interest rates down, but get growth up. What we're doing is sort of fiddling around the edges. These issues are important, but the underlying issues to have a growth strategy. And I think that's been the worry for the last 2 years, that we haven't had that. But you're right. And it's always, just to conclude maybe, when Brown and Blair came in '97, they surprised, shall we say, the markets with making the Bank of England independent. There's this perception that while Andy Burnham is committed to devolution, and it's not clear it will work fully in practice, the
Gerard.
markets are also thinking, will he surprise us with something next week?
Gerard Lyons, Chief Economist at Net Wealth and Research Fellow at the Centre for Policy Studies. Great to have you on the programme. Thank you.
And the Sun have done this, and they've taken the tax calculator from Tax Policy Associates, which is Dan Needle's outfit, isn't it? And this is about a levy of 1.28% on the value of the land. And you can put your borough where you live and the council tax band that you're in and see what would happen. And there are some, we've done it with lots of different places around London, for example, and you get some where relatively small properties go where their council tax doubles. I've seen one where it goes from 3,000 to 15,000 a year.
We saw one this morning which went from about 3,800 to 38,000.
And apparently there are 21,000 homes across London could face annual bills exceeding 50,000 and land. So you have to be super rich for this, but could you imagine paying £3,000 a year council tax and that going up to £10,000 a year? Would you be able to stay in your house if that was,
lots of people
was
wouldn't.
true? And what happens then to the value of houses if everyone has to try and panic sell them? Does that actually work?